That's why he was hired, to maintain continuity. I think they're going to be just fine. Now, I'm not expecting them or picking them to win 10, 12, 14 games. No. But I think to not have them in the top 10 is a little laughable, at least at this point. Hello and welcome in. It's always college football. I'm Greg McElroy. We hope that you're having a terrific start to your week. Sorry we weren't with you yesterday. I was traveling. Some challenges traveling out of Dallas-Fort Worth. We've had some weather in the forecast. We've had some chaos in the forecast, but we are home and we are now prepared to talk some college football with you. Mark Kubiak's here, Jack Foster's here, Jake Garcia's here as always, and we appreciate you coming to us from wherever it is you're coming to us from, whether that's via the podcast, whether that's via the ESPN YouTube channel. Continue to encourage all of you to like, rate, and subscribe. We appreciate all that you have done for the show up to this point. Numbers have gone through the roof. Downloads have gone through the roof. We're very grateful to all of you for that. We have a great show for you today. One of the most controversial off-season topics that we have every single year, and it's the gift that keeps on giving every June. The ESPN FPI. That's right. That. For some of you, that's a curse word. I'm saying it's like cussing. FPI is the worst thing ever. And I don't disagree with you all the time. I think there are aspects of it that are applicable. And there are some things about it this year that I really agree with. So I'm going to tell you today, what did they get right? What did they get wrong? Here's some teams that are ranked way too low. Here's a couple teams that are ranked way too high. So we'll have some fun with the FPI. But remember, these are analytical projections. I don't think they're going to necessarily hold a lot of credibility once we get into the season. I can promise you that. We're also going to dive into the mailbag. A couple interesting questions. One about Syracuse, one about the Big 12 and whether or not it will attract top coaching candidates in the future, and media darlings. So a lot that we need to get to, and we don't want to put any more time off. Let's get to the FPI. What do they get right about the FPI here in 2024? It's a very controversial topic for those of us that cover the sport, for those of us that are employed by outlets that put forth information like this. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I don't do a lot of analytics as it relates to measuring teams. I just don't. I don't think it's that necessary. I do think it's applicable when looking back and measuring teams up with their offensive efficiency numbers, defense, special teams. You can get efficiency numbers when you look back at the season, but projecting forward, especially nowadays in college football, man, it's so hard to do. Think about how many different pieces are going to be stepping into new roles, and maybe they're not as efficient. Maybe they're not as comfortable in that scheme, but we anticipate them being the same player that they were, or in some ways improved. But the transfer portal has made it really hard to put forth an FPI ranking projection based on what these teams are going to do. Now, know that the FPI is not necessarily measuring wins and losses. It's how you'd fare when playing against an average FBS football team. So if you played a team that is ranked 67th, this is how many points you would likely beat them by. Georgia comes in at number 1. Should come as no surprise, okay? They are expected to beat the average team by about 4 touchdowns. So kind of get the drift. This is not a projection. This is not a who's going to win what. It's pure probability and based on a million simulations. So let's start with what the FPI got right. The FPI got the top 5 right. Now, what I would push back on is that I don't think it was necessarily in the correct order, because you know how I feel about Ohio State this year. I think Ohio State, on paper, based on what they add, the difference makers that they have, the efficiencies that I expect them to have on the defensive side, one of the top defenses in the country, one of the top offenses in the country, because Chip Kelly's calling the plays. You have a dynamic 1-2 punch at running back. I'm not worried about the departures at wide receiver. I'm just not. It's Ohio State. They'll be fine at wideout. And I'm not worried about the quarterback spot, because I expect Will Howard to be a little better than what we got last year, at times from Kyle McCord. Ohio State's at 4, according to the FPI, behind Texas and Oregon. And I'll tell you the problem that I have too now is we are assessing, and you'll hear a little more about this here in a moment. I think it's really tough to predict that Oregon, who comes in as the FPI number 2, I have them in the top 5. Like I said, top 5 is correct. I just don't have them in the same order as the FPI. It's the same 5 teams. I just think you can kind of mix and match who goes where and how you would stack them all up. I have a little reservations right now when it comes to teams that are entering a new league. Not saying that they can't win the league, but I just think back to when other teams have made realignment adjustments and they've gone from one league to the next league. There is a little bit of a learning curve there, learning who these teams are. Now, let's take Oregon, for example. When Oregon was in the Pac, they knew all the Pac-12 teams' identities. They knew all the coaches. They recruited the players. Like, they knew all these different teams. Well, now Oregon jumps into the Big Ten, and they have to learn 14 new schools. Obviously, not all on their schedule, but they have to learn what it's like. Hey, where do you travel to? What is the challenges when it comes to those travel days? Where should you stay in the hotel? Things like that. Things that other teams already know is a little bit of a challenge. Now, is it hard for Ohio State to, for instance, go play at Oregon? Sure, of course. So there's a little advantage that goes back and forth. But when you are a new team in a new league, I think it's harder to get acclimated as a new team in a new league than it is as an existing team by adding new teams to that league. So I think Georgia has an advantage over Texas because they're very familiar with 14 if you include themselves, 14 of the 16 teams that are currently in the SEC. Texas is really familiar with probably 4 of the teams that are now in the SEC based on the fact that they played Bama each of the last 2 years. They've had to play against quality teams in the past from the SEC. So they're familiar, but just not as familiar. So I look at the teams that are jumping into a new league. I think they're at a slight disadvantage. So to have 2 teams like Oregon and Texas at 2 and 3 respectively, I would have them a little bit further down the list. Now, I think Oregon's top 5 team. I think Texas is top 5 team. But I would probably have them at, say, 4 and 5 as opposed to 2 and 3 in that vicinity. Ohio State should be no worse than 2. They should probably be number 1 based on what they return. But having Georgia at 1, having Ohio State at 2, either order doesn't necessarily matter. And then Bama, I think, should be in, at worst, at number 5. Now, people will say, well, they lost a lot of pieces in the back end defensively. Don't disagree with that whatsoever. I don't think they've done a pretty good job of addressing some of those needs in the back end. And I do think they might be a little bit more thin than they've been in the past. But when you get down the list a little bit, and you start to look at, all right, who's 6, who's 7, who's 8, who's 9. When you start comparing what Alabama is against, say, what Oklahoma is, who's into 8, I feel a little better about what Alabama has relative to what Oklahoma has, at least at this juncture. So I would have Alabama right there. I think no worse than 5, probably even a touch higher than that, depending on how you kind of sort them out between Oregon, Texas, and Alabama. So that's what they got right. I think they got the top 5 right. They just didn't get the order right. What did they get wrong? Now, there's a lot that they got wrong. But for simplicity purposes, I don't want to go through and be like, well, UTSA is better than 56th. Okay, we don't need to go there. All right. Let's just kind of look at overarching themes centering around the ACC. And the ACC is drastically underrated, according to the FBI. They have 0 teams that are currently ranked in the top 10. They have just 6 teams in the top 40. That's wild when you take that into account. The fact that Florida State is their highest ranked team at number 11 is a little surprising. And frankly, to have Clemson at 15, Louisville at 21, Miami at 23, SMU at 25, and then NC State at 28. That's it for the ACC in the top 40. Notably missing from that list, Virginia Tech, they're 50th. Georgia Tech, they're 54th. I mean, we're talking middle-of-the-road teams in the country when you start getting into the 50s. And I'm sorry, I think Virginia Tech is a whole lot better than a middle-of-the-road team. I think Georgia Tech, from a ceiling standpoint, a whole lot better, assuming they kind of solve some of their woes on defense. I'm really optimistic about the ACC. Now, I look at the bottom of the ACC. Yeah, I understand. Not great. But the top of the ACC is pretty dang good, y'all. Like Florida State, playoff contender. Absolutely. Clemson, playoff contender. Absolutely. Miami, I think they're absolutely a playoff contender, and the FPI has them at 23. NC State, I think, is a playoff contender, and they're at 28. Now, SMU at 25, like we talked about a moment ago. When you make that leap, especially the leap from the G5 to the P5, it's a lot steeper learning curve. What happened to Cincinnati? What happened to UCF? What happened to Houston? What happened to BYU? What happened to TCU 12 years ago? What happened to Utah when they made the leap from the Mountain West to the Pac-12? There were growing pains. And I think there could be growing pains for SMU. Now, I think they're more well-equipped to make the leap than most, but I also think to expect them to be a 10-win football team feels a bit like a reach at the moment. They'll be good, but 10-win, 9-win, I don't know, man. Start looking at that 25 range with the FPI, just seems like we're asking an awful lot of a team that has never played this level of competition from week to week in their existence, or at least in their recent existence. So I think the ACC, the FPI completely missed on. I think they are much, much stronger at the top. And I think to have a list of 20 teams based on preseason expectations, paper, basically, on paper, do you really think there's 22 teams better than Miami? Seriously. When looking at what they have and the pieces that they've added in the portal this offseason and the disappearances off the roster from last year that frankly didn't help them a whole lot, and they had guys that turned it over at quarterback, they insert an immediate difference maker in Cam Ward. You have really quality pieces at running back like Damian Martinez, who transferred over from Oregon State. You have a solid offensive line. You have arguably the best defensive end in the ACC in Ruben Bain. I mean, they have everything that you could possibly want. Can you honestly tell me right now that there are 22 teams on paper that you feel better about than Miami? No way. No way you can make that argument. Not right now. Are there 27 teams that you feel better about than NC State? Look at what they have on paper. Just look at it. Jordan Waters, adding him from Duke. Grayson McCall, the quarterback, adding him from Coastal Carolina. Pair what they have at wide receiver. Casey Concepcion is back, entering into year number 2. Tony Gibson's defense, what they've always had. You really think there's 27 teams better than NC State? I disagree. That's going to be a good football team this year, and they might just sneak up and surprise a lot of folks and root to what would be a huge surprise in the ACC if they were somehow able to get to the conference title game. I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibility. So the ACC as a whole is significantly better than the FPI is giving them credit for. That's what the FPI got wrong. Who's ranked too low? Now, there's a handful that I could go down. I just gave you a few. Miami, NC State, a handful of others. But y'all, we're looking at the defending national champion, the Michigan Wolverines, sitting there at number 12. Now, I understand that they lost a lot off last year's team. I understand that replacing J.J. McCarthy, understand replacing Blake Corum, replacing some key pieces along the offensive line, replacing Roman Wilson, replacing a couple good defenders. Y'all, they're still super elite. Top 3, top 5, top 8 defense in the country without even thinking about it. And while I don't expect them to go out and score 40 a game, I think you might have to score 20 to beat them, and that's not going to be a real easy task. They're going to be that good on the defensive side of the football. So for them to come back, a team that has completely dominated the Big Ten the last 3 years, en route to 3 consecutive college football playoff appearances, en route to 3 consecutive Big Ten championships, now we expand the field to 12, and we think that Michigan's probably not going to make it? I don't know, man. 12 seems way too low for the defending national champions. I know there's been turnover. I know Jim Harbaugh's not there, but Sharon Moore is. That's why he was hired, to maintain continuity. I think they're going to be just fine. I'm not expecting them or picking them to win 10, 12, 14 games. No, I'm not picking them to win the Big Ten. But I think to not have them in the top 10 is a little laughable, at least at this point. Let's move next to the Ole Miss Rebels. Now, I, for one, am not one that's putting Ole Miss in the top 5 in the preseason. That to me feels a little bit aggressive. But I can understand the thought process for those that have put them in the top 5. I understand the thought process. The schedule is more manageable than it's ever been. You avoid a game against Alabama. You still get Georgia. You still get LSU. You still have some difficult teams. But the schedule is a little bit more manageable than it's been in the past. And you look at the additions that they've made defensively. You add Princely Umanmielen, defensive end from Florida. You add Walter Nolan, game-changing defensive tackle from Texas A&M. You add Juice Wells to what's already a very deep and talented group of weapons at wide receiver and tight end. He's from South Carolina. You add Ja'Cory Koski-Merritt from New Mexico, a bunch of others that you've added in the transfer portal. It feels like nobody has attacked the portal like Ole Miss this offseason. You bring back a veteran quarterback in Jackson Dart. You got a coach that broke through last year in Lane Kiffin, registered a couple of wins against double-digit win teams, against LSU and against Penn State. That was a huge issue for Lane Kiffin the last couple of years. He had to take the monkey off his back and get things done by beating teams that win double-digit games. That had been a problem for him. He hadn't done it very much in his career. I think he'd done it one time in his career prior to last year where he did it twice. So I think Ole Miss is in a really good spot to break through. Manageable non-conference schedule with Furman, Middle Tennessee, Georgia Southern, and Wake Forest. Should go 4-0 at the very least. You avoid Alabama. Ole Miss at 16 to me feels way too low going into the season. I'd probably have them in the vicinity of 8 or 9, but to have them at 16 to me feels aggressive. And then finally, a team that is way too low, and like I said, there's a bunch that we could have chosen from. Oklahoma State at 26. Now, I understand maybe Mike Gundy, maybe he is calling the people at ESPN.com, calling the analytics experts saying, hey guys, push us down a little bit. Like, we operate really well when no one's paying attention to us. We operate really well when the expectations for us coming into the season are a little bit lower because nobody's talking about Oklahoma State. Like, I feel like I'm going crazy. Am I missing something here? Am I missing? Like, I watched them in person, I might add. I called the game in the Big 12 title game last year. And while it wasn't crazy competitive against Texas, it wasn't. They still have everything that you could possibly want in the new look Big 12 to be competitive and potentially make a playoff push. They returned 21 starters. That includes the Doak Walker Award winner in Ollie Gordon. The offense is going to run through him. Remember, once they figured out who they were last year in the final 9 games of the season, they were a completely different looking outfit offensively. You bring back a 7th-year quarterback in Alan Bowman, who threw for nearly 3,500 yards last year. You have your top 3 wide receivers back, including DeJon Stribling, who missed most of last year with an injury, was supposed to be their best guy coming into the season. You bring back 7 offensive linemen who made multiple starts last year. And then defensively, you have to replace 1 key linebacker, but everyone else is back. You've got Colin Oliver and Nicholas Martin there at the second level. 2nd year in Bryden Nardo's defense. You know they're going to be better defensively as far as just understanding the scheme here in 2024. Last year was a completely new approach to playing defense. They went from 4 down defensive linemen to 3 down defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, 3 safeties, a unique structure. And there's a bit of a learning curve there, but I think they figured it out. And I'm not saying they're going to be a top 10 defense in the country. No, they're not. But I do think with the way they can run the football, the way they can shrink the game, there's a real chance for that group to be significantly better here in 2024. Let's go to the teams that are ranked a little bit too high. Oklahoma. Oklahoma comes in at number 8. We talked earlier about Oregon and Texas and SMU and the transition into new leagues and how I think there's some challenges there. And if you look at Oklahoma's schedule, particularly in November, man, and I know the FPI isn't supposed to take into account the final record. It's just how you would fare when you played against average football teams. And clearly, FPI really values what Oklahoma has. I think Oklahoma's a top 10, 12, 15 defense at worst in college football. At worst. Should be really good at all 3 levels. I love what they have in the back end. Bowman's excellent. We look at what they have at the second level. Danny Stutzman's excellent. Like, they're going to be really, really good defensively. I feel great about that group collectively from top to bottom. I think offensively, they got a chance to be pretty good. I'd like to see a little bit more of a commitment to the run game. I think you're going to get that with Seth Luttrell, the new offensive coordinator. I think Jackson Arnold, as long as he can avoid the big mistake, which he didn't do in his 1 start last year, they're going to be fine. I think they're going to commit to running the football a little bit more. I think Deion Burks is a superstar, has a chance to become a superstar at the very least. I think this offense is going to be challenging, but to have them at number 8 to me feels a bit aggressive. Just a bit aggressive. Now, where would I have Oklahoma? Probably around 15, which is a great spot, I might add. A great spot heading into a new league where the competition is difficult and your schedule is among the most difficult in the sport. You have a road trip to Auburn. You have road trips to other places. You bring Bama to you. I mean, they have a very, very difficult gauntlet Oklahoma has to play. But at the same time, man, to have them at 8, just a little bit too much. I think they're going to be good. I do. I think they're going to be good. But top 8 in the country, man, that feels just a little bit aggressive. And then finally, team that feels ranked a little too high for me is the Kansas Jayhawks. Look, they are, according to the FPI, the top-ranked team in the Big 12. Now, I think Kansas has a really high ceiling, but it's almost exclusively dependent on the health and availability of Jalen Daniels at quarterback. Now, ESPN also put out the quarterback tiers ranking, and Jalen Daniels is there in the second tier amongst quarterbacks. But when he's been available, his numbers actually compare very favorably to Michael Penix from a year ago. The problem is he has not been available. He's missed time 2 years ago, and he missed all but 4 games last year. So I have to know that Jalen Daniels is going to be healthy for 12 games before I'm willing to jump on board the bandwagon with Kansas there in the top 17 in the country. Are they a top 25 team? Potentially. Are they top 30? More than likely. Are they a threat to win the Big 12? 100%. But to go as far as to say they're a top 17 team in the country, the top ranked team in the Big 12, that feels like it's a bridge too far. Right now, I would have them behind Kansas State, who does have to replace some key pieces up front offensively. I would have them behind Utah, which does have to replace a couple key pieces on the defensive side, but they get Cam Rising back. And I'd probably have them behind Oklahoma State, who we talked about a moment ago, sits at number 26 in the FPI rankings for the Big 12. So Kansas, good, very dangerous, but are they good enough to be the top-ranked team in the Big 12 according to the FPI? That to me feels like it's a little bit too much. One other item of note, the highest-ranked group of 5 team is Boise State, and they come in at 48th. Okay? According to FPI, group of 5 schools, the likelihood of making the college football playoff, Boise State sits at 17%, UT San Antonio sits at 16%, Liberty at 9%, and Memphis at 7%. They are 48, 56 is UTSA, Liberty 79, and Memphis is at 66. I just want you to think about this for a moment. Yes, at least for the next couple years, the G5 will have representation in the college football playoff. But how much longer will that happen? I'm really curious. Because I think when you look at the gap that's currently existing, and this is, remember, this is no bias computer simulations. And I'm not saying they're right all the time either. But the fact that the top-ranked G5 team that is guaranteed a playoff spot, and right now in the preseason, they are no higher than 48th, is concerning. And I would imagine this will be something they'll look at in the future. If that gap continues to widen, maybe the G5 will find themselves on the way out, and then we'll finally set up the G5 playoff, which I've long been clamoring for because I think crowning a champion at the G5 level is more valuable than being a one and done in the college football playoff among some of the big boys. Moving on to our mailbag segment. Now, we always enjoy the mailbag. Submit your mailbag questions to us via social media at alwayscfb on both Instagram and on Twitter. Jack is constantly looking through those. So if you submit a question, we'll definitely put it in the mailbag at some point. Like, we haven't gotten to it yet, but we will. You can also submit mailbag questions to our email at alwayscollegefootball@gmail.com. So we appreciate those of you that have submitted those these last couple months. And like I said, we have a long list that we're getting to, but some of the best ones get moved at the top. So if you have a great question that are kind of helpful for this upcoming season, or maybe big picture college football, we'll go there with you whenever you want. So Coobs, where are we going today?
Or if you're Jack's friend, because this first question comes from Jack's friend Caleb in Tennessee. He asks, which team has the chance to be the unexpected early season media darling? 2 years ago, it was Kansas. Last year, it was Colorado.
Well, Colorado is not going anywhere. So Colorado is 100%, and you can call them a media darling, what have you. They're just a polarizing team. Like, everybody has some semblance of interest in Colorado, whether you like them, root against them, love Coach Prime, hate Coach Prime, no matter how you feel, Colorado invokes some type of internal reaction for most people that consume the sport. They'll be on opening night against North Dakota State. I would imagine a lot of people will be rooting against them in that game. A lot of people are rooting for them in that game. So I'm looking forward to seeing Colorado. They're not going anywhere. They will continue to be a media darling. I'll tell you another team that I felt like was a bit of a media darling last year. Not because they weren't good. They were really good. But the media was all about them, some Oregon Ducks. They were all about the Oregon Ducks. I mean, my goodness, as soon as they beat Colorado the way they beat Colorado, which was really impressive, I might add, they completely dominated the Buffaloes there in week 4 or 5. At the time, Colorado was ranked number 19. We acted like, oh my goodness, that was the biggest win in the history of the world. Okay, don't disagree with any of that. It was a great win. It was a dominant win, but I think it said more about Colorado than it did about Oregon. Then we watched them against Washington. They didn't look that great in the game, to be honest with you. They lost it, had a couple of chances for sure, but missed out on some fourth down opportunities. Next thing you know, Washington wins. The next thing you know, it's like you look at the rankings a couple weeks later, like Oregon's ahead of Washington. Like, what the heck is going on? Like, am I taking crazy pills here? And then we fast forward a little bit more, like, oh, they beat Utah so badly. Yeah, they beat Utah. Utah wasn't good. They weren't good compared to what we've expected Utah to be in the past. They dominated Cal. Oh, great. Like, I feel like we just really propped up Oregon last year. And like I said, I think Oregon's awesome. They are the real deal. But at the same time, I felt like they were a bit of a media darling and got really bumped up having beaten average teams or below average teams very convincingly. So I think Oregon has a chance to be in that position again. And I think the media, they always like underdogs. A couple of years ago, it was TCU. We've seen a million examples of teams that are, now getting that opportunity. Like, I could see the media really rallying behind an SMU team that gets hot in the ACC. Like, if SMU gets off to a great start, look out. I could see the media being all about the SMU Mustangs for sure. I also think that teams that score a lot of points are going to captivate the media's attention. So teams that are going to score, even if they're lethargic or average or below average defensively, teams that can score are going to get people's attention. I think the media is going to gravitate towards Miami this year. I've already told you I think they're going to be good. I think they have an exciting quarterback. I think they have excellent playmakers. I think the media has a bit of a love-hate relationship with Miami. So I think Miami will generate a lot of attention, at least early in the season. So there's a bunch. But like I said, I think they gravitate towards polarizing teams, and they absolutely will always gravitate towards teams that are a little bit of an underdog mentality.
Speaking of underdogs, this next question comes from Eric in New York. He asks, just saw your video on conference championship droughts. You mentioned several teams in the ACC, but what are your thoughts on Syracuse? Soft schedule, massive upgrade in talent. The biggest question is, will it translate on the field? But if it does, it can be a big way.
Well, I look at where Syracuse is from a personnel standpoint compared to where they were a year ago. Y'all, Syracuse's personnel compared to last year is significantly better at the top end. I mean, significantly better. And I think Fran Brown, like, I was on the record. I knew Fran Brown as a great recruiter. I don't know what he is as a head coach just yet. I know he's going to put the pieces together. That's for sure. But now it's about, can he get the guys to the next level? He's already been able to stockpile talent from a lot of different places. I mean, he's gone out. He's gotten Fadil Diggs from Texas A&M. He went out and he got Kyle McCord from Ohio State, who is probably about as high profile a transfer as you're going to find. And then this past year, you're looking at guys that are in the ESPN 300 that are signing with Syracuse. And we're not used to seeing that. Like, King Joseph Edwards is a top 300 player in the ESPN 300. Like, we're not used to seeing that. They added 18 transfer portal players, which is really impressive. 12 of those 18 are from the Power 5. So their roster across the board is really good. The problem is, you say it's a soft schedule. I don't know if I would necessarily go that far. Is it relatively manageable? Perhaps. But I think Georgia Tech's pretty good. I think that's a game that's going to be a real toss-up. I think a road trip to NC State is going to be a really difficult game. I think Miami at your place, very difficult game. Road trip to Cal, that could be a tricky game as well. Like, I think there's some very difficult games on the schedule. You're at UNLV. UNLV last year had one of the better teams in the G5. I don't think it's one that you should lose, but it's one that is certainly losable. So I look at the schedule and how it all lines up for Syracuse, and I think they're going to be somewhere in the vicinity of 7-5, right around there. That feels like it's progress a little bit. Maybe they can get to 8-4, and I would be surprised if they don't beat someone that you don't expect them to beat. But to expect them to win the conference this year in Fran Brown's first year, to me, is a bridge too far. I'm going to evaluate the progress made this year and see if they can carry over some of that momentum into next year. Whereas in 25, 26, and 27, especially if the ACC gets kind of thrown up and people are leaving right and left, then that's when they can really start to kind of make their presence felt in a league that feels very winnable in the future.
Last question here comes from Sean in Florida. He says, could you ever see a coach leaving the SEC or Big Ten for a job in the ACC or Big 12? Even a middle tier program in the SEC and Big Ten feels like it would have an advantage over top tier ACC or Big 12. Am I off on assuming that?
Well, Sean, I think it's a great question. It's one I've thought about actually quite a bit. Okay, so answer me this. Are you better served being at the, say, 9th or 10th best program in the SEC or the Big Ten? Or are you better served being the number 1, number 2, or number 3 program in the Big 12? Like, I look at the ACC a little bit differently just because they have some massive brands. I mean, Florida State, Miami, Clemson, they're not taking the backseat to many, right? But in the Big 12, the brands aren't quite the same. They're a little tougher to win. I mean, yeah, Oklahoma State has had pockets of great success. Kansas State, similar. You look at what Arizona has had in the past at times. Yeah, they've been salty at times. Colorado's won a national championship. It's been 35 years, but they've won a national championship. I look at the Big 12, and I just don't think the brands are quite as established as the brands that you see in the ACC. So I would say that the Big 12 would be just a step below in general as far as the jobs that you would potentially take. Now, as far as finances, it's all about finances, right? Like, you're not going to take a job. Yeah, I can win here, but I'm going to take a lot less money. I think it depends on what those teams at the top of the Big 12 or the ACC would be able to pay. I think the ACC could pay top dollar. We just saw Florida State give Mike Norvell $80 million over the next 10 years, or $10 million a year for the next 8 years, whatever it is. Mario Cristobal is well compensated as well. And Dabo Swinney, I believe, as of like 4 months ago, was one of the top paid coaches in the sport. So I think it depends a little bit on what you're shelling out. I'm not sure where Mike Gundy fits. I don't know where Chris Kleiman fits. I don't know where Kyle Whittingham fits. I know where Deion Sanders is around $5.5 million a year. That pales in comparison to the 11 or 12 that Dabo had, the 10 plus that Mike Norvell has, and the 8 and change that Mario Cristobal has. So I think it depends a little bit on finances, but I could see down the road, if all finances become equal, which I find that kind of hard to believe, access to the playoff will be of the utmost importance. I mean, for a while, do you really want to go and get your teeth kicked in and root to a 7-5 season? Or do you want to go somewhere where there's legitimate upside and you might actually have a chance to go win a national championship? I don't know. I think the SEC and the Big Ten are absolutely the destination. You look at what transpired with Oregon State and Jonathan Smith leaving Oregon State to become the head coach at Michigan State. You look at some of the other movement that has happened in the past. I think it's hard to win at lower tier programs. I do. I think it's really hard to win at lower tier programs. But I do think if you can get to a middle tier in a top league, you're in a really good spot. So it's a great question. I think it's one that we'll just have to evaluate over the course of time. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to ask all of you to like, rate, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your show. We appreciate all of you for supporting us for the last couple of years, and we look forward to continuing to dive in to college football content here for the next 6 or 7 months. Man, the season is right around the corner. We are well within 100 days. I believe it's like 84 days, 83 days or so until toe meets leather in week 0. It won't be long before we start to dive into it. We already start to have some rankings. We got the FPI today. We got some mailbag questions. Continue to submit questions to the mailbag. And we appreciate all of you for contributing to the show the way you have over the last couple months. For all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have a wonderful day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.